Sheikh Khaled Al Noor was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Dubai, known for his extravagant lifestyle and mysterious aura. In his late 50s, he lived in a palace that seemed like it came straight out of a fairy tale, surrounded by gold, luxury, and everything money could buy. Yet, behind the glittering facade of wealth, there was something unsettling about him, something that people whispered about but never dared to speak openly. Born into one of the richest families in Dubai, Khaled was raised in privilege. From a young age, he learned that power and money could get him anything he wanted. By the time he was 20, he had taken over his family's business empire, expanding it into oil, real estate, and luxury hotels. His name became famous, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. To many, he was a symbol of success and ambition. But as much as people admired him, they also feared him. Khaled was known for his need to control everything around him. From the smallest details of his life to the lives of those close to him, nothing escaped his watchful eye. His charm and polished appearance often hid the darker parts of his personality, his obsession with perfection and his inability to tolerate anything that didn't go his way. This obsession extended to his personal life, especially when it came to marriage. Sheikh Khaled was infamous for marrying young brides, most of them barely out of their teenage years. These marriages were always kept private, and his wives were rarely seen in public. People often wondered what happened to them, but no one dared to ask. Some said they were sent back to their families after the sheikh lost interest. Others whispered that they simply disappeared. Despite these rumors, Khaled remained untouchable. His wealth and connections shielded him from scrutiny. To the public, he appeared as a generous and devout man. He donated to charities, hosted lavish events, and carried himself with an air of kindness that made it hard to believe the stories about him. But those who worked for him saw a different side, a man who demanded total obedience and punished even the smallest mistakes. Khaled's charm was undeniable. At social events, he could make anyone feel special, with his deep voice and warm smile. But behind closed doors, his need for control turned into something much darker. Every aspect of his brides' lives was monitored. There were cameras in every room of his palace, and his staff reported everything back to him. He expected absolute loyalty, and any sign of defiance was met with anger. To most people, Sheikh Khaled was a larger-than-life figure, a man who seemed to have everything. But beneath the surface, his world was built on control, secrecy, and fear. And while he appeared invincible, his obsession with power and perfection would eventually lead to his downfall, something even he could not foresee. Emily Carter was just 17 years old, a bright and hopeful girl living in a quiet, struggling town in Texas. Her life revolved around her family, a close-knit unit held together by love, despite their growing financial struggles. The Carters lived in a small, run-down house on the edge of town, where creaking floorboards and a leaky roof were constant reminders of how hard life had become. Emily, the eldest of 3 siblings, carried the weight of her family's dreams on her young shoulders. Her father, James, had worked as a mechanic for years until a back injury left him unable to work. Medical bills piled up quickly, adding to the stress of unpaid rent and everyday expenses. Emily's mother, Linda, took on cleaning jobs around town, but her earnings were barely enough to keep the family afloat. Emily often skipped meals so her younger brother and sister wouldn't have to. She worked part-time at a local diner after school, doing her best to contribute, but it was never enough. The family was drowning in debt, and hope seemed like a distant memory. Despite the hardships, Emily dreamed of a better life. She was smart, hardworking, and determined to rise above her circumstances. She wanted to become a teacher someday, to give kids like her a chance at a brighter future. But as the bills piled up and eviction notices loomed, her dreams began to feel impossible. One evening, a stranger arrived at their doorstep. Her name was Mrs. Harris, a well-dressed woman with a confident smile and a calm, persuasive voice. She claimed to be a marriage broker, someone who arranged matches for wealthy men looking for brides. Linda hesitated at first, unsure of what the woman was offering. But Mrs. Harris didn't give up easily. She painted a dazzling picture of what life could be like for Emily. "Imagine this," she said, her voice soft and sweet. "Your daughter living in a palace, surrounded by wealth and comfort. She'll have everything she could ever need. Servants, designer clothes, the finest education. And your family? You'll never have to worry about money again. All your debts will be gone." Linda and James exchanged uncertain glances. The idea sounded too good to be true, but they were desperate. Mrs. Harris seemed to sense their hesitation and pulled out her phone, showing photos of other girls who had married wealthy men overseas. "Look at these girls," she said. "They're living like royalty now. Their families are taken care of, just like yours could be." Emily, standing silently in the corner, listened as her parents asked questions. Mrs. Harris assured them that the man she had in mind, a Dubai sheikh, was kind and generous. "Yes, he's older," she admitted, "but he'll provide a life for Emily that you could only dream of." The promise of a better future for Emily and their family began to outweigh their doubts. The broker offered them a large sum of money as a gift once the marriage was finalized. $500,000, a figure so enormous it made Linda's hands tremble. They could pay off James's medical bills, cover the rent, and even send Emily's siblings to good schools. It seemed like a miracle. But for Emily, the decision wasn't easy. She didn't care about fancy clothes or grand homes. She loved her family deeply and wanted to help them, but the thought of leaving them behind for an uncertain future scared her. As her parents debated, Emily sat in silence, thinking of her father's pain, her mother's exhaustion, and her siblings' hopeful faces. Finally, she spoke up. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "If it helps the family, I'll do it." In that moment, Emily believed she was making the ultimate sacrifice, a choice to save her family at the cost of her own freedom. Little did she know, the path she had just agreed to would take her far from the dreams she cherished and into a world darker than she could ever imagine. The deal was sealed, and within days, arrangements were made for Emily to leave her small Texas town. As she packed her modest belongings into a single suitcase, she told herself this was the right thing to do. But deep down, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into the unknown, and that her life would never be the same again. The offer from Mrs. Harris, the marriage broker, felt like a lifeline to Emily's family. Sitting in their cramped living room with peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture, she laid out the plan in simple terms. "This marriage will solve all your problems," she said, her voice calm and confident. "Your debts will be paid, and Emily will live a life of luxury." At first, Emily's parents hesitated. They couldn't imagine sending their eldest daughter away to marry a man she had never met, let alone someone from a different country. "She's too young," Linda said, her voice trembling. "She's only 17. But Mrs. Harris, well practiced in her craft, had an answer for everything. "Age is just a number," she replied smoothly. "And on paper, we can make her 19. It's all legal and taken care of. She'll be treated like a queen in Dubai. The sheikh is a kind man with a heart of gold. He wants a young bride to start a family, and Emily is perfect." The broker then delivered the bait that made the decision even harder to refuse. "The sheikh is willing to pay $500,000 as a gift to your family once the marriage is finalized," she said, pulling out a document to show the amount. The sum was staggering, more money than the Carters had ever dreamed of. With that, they could pay off their debts, cover James's medical expenses, and ensure a better life for Emily's younger siblings. Emily sat quietly, listening to the conversation unfold. Her heart was heavy with worry for her family. She saw her father, pale and weak, wincing with every movement. She saw her mother's tired eyes, worn down from long hours of cleaning other people's houses. She saw her younger brother and sister, both too young to understand the depth of their family's struggles. Her parents argued in hushed voices after Mrs. Harris left. James didn't want to send Emily away, but Linda kept looking at the numbers. "We don't have another choice," she said finally, her voice breaking. "We're drowning in debt, and this is the only way to save the family." The next day, Mrs. Harris returned, ready to finalize the arrangements. She brought forged papers that would officially make Emily 19 years old, legally clearing the way for the marriage. She also brought a dress, a modest white gown that Emily would wear for the ceremony, and a few expensive-looking gifts meant to convince the family of the Sheikh's generosity. Emily watched her parents sign the papers, their hands shaking with a mix of relief and guilt. She felt like a bystander in her own life, as if the decisions being made were for someone else. When Mrs. Harris turned to her with a pen, Emily hesitated. "You're doing this for your family," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. Emily nodded, her own eyes welling up with tears, and signed the papers. She didn't fully understand what she was agreeing to, but she believed it was the only way to save the people she loved. "I'll make it work," she thought to herself. "I'll be strong for them." In the days that followed, preparations moved quickly. Mrs. Harris coached Emily on how to behave, teaching her basic Arabic phrases and proper etiquette for life in a wealthy household. "Always smile, never question him, and show respect," she instructed. Emily packed her belongings into a single suitcase, including a worn photo of her family and a few small trinkets that reminded her of home. The night before she was set to leave, Emily sat with her parents, trying to memorize their faces. Her father, unable to hold back his emotions, pulled her into a hug. "If you're ever unhappy, come back to us," he whispered. "We'll figure it out." But deep down, they all knew there was no turning back. The money had already been promised, and the Carters had started paying off their debts. Emily had become their only hope. On the morning of her departure, a black car arrived to take Emily to the airport. Mrs. Harris gave final instructions, smoothing out the fabric of Emily's dress and fixing her hair. "You'll be fine," she said, her voice dripping with reassurance. "You're about to start a new life." As Emily hugged her family goodbye, she fought back tears, telling herself she was making the right choice. But as the car drove away, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. She was leaving everything she knew behind for a future she couldn't imagine, all for the sake of her family. And in her heart, she couldn't shake the fear that she was walking into something far darker than she could comprehend. As the plane touched down in Dubai, Emily felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. She had never been outside her small town in Texas, and now she was in a city she had only seen in pictures: bright lights, glittering skyscrapers, and a sense of endless wealth. She clutched her passport tightly as she walked through the bustling airport, her heart racing with nerves. Waiting for her at the VIP exit was a man in a tailored black suit, holding a sign with her name. He introduced himself as one of the Sheikh's assistants, speaking politely but firmly. "Come this way, Miss Emily," he said, leading her to a sleek black car with tinted windows. Everything felt surreal: the luxury, the precision, the efficiency. As the car drove through the city, Emily gazed out of the window, awestruck. The towering Burj Khalifa seemed to touch the sky, while palm trees lined wide streets filled with expensive cars. She had never seen anything like it. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe this could be the fresh start her family needed. The car eventually pulled up to a massive gate guarded by uniformed men. The gates opened slowly, revealing a sprawling estate that looked like something out of a fairy tale. The Sheikh's palace was enormous, with gleaming white walls, ornate gold accents, and fountains that sparkled in the sunlight. Emily stared in disbelief as the car glided down a long driveway lined with perfectly manicured gardens. When she stepped out of the car, a team of staff was waiting to greet her. Maids in matching uniforms bowed slightly, and a butler gestured toward the entrance. "Welcome to your new home, Miss Emily," he said warmly. Emily followed them inside, her shoes clicking on the polished marble floors. The inside of the palace was even more breathtaking than the outside. Chandeliers glittered above her head, casting rainbows across the walls. Expensive rugs covered the floors, and every corner was decorated with gold, crystal, or rare artwork. It was a world she couldn't have imagined, even in her wildest dreams. Her assigned maid, a quiet woman named Layla, showed her to her room. It wasn't just a bedroom, it was an entire suite. The bed was enormous, draped in silk sheets, with fluffy pillows stacked neatly. A walk-in closet held rows of designer clothes, handbags, and shoes in every color. On a table by the window, a vase of fresh roses sat next to an ornate jewelry box filled with glittering bracelets and earrings. Emily could hardly believe her eyes. "Is all this for me?" she asked hesitantly. Layla nodded with a small smile. "Yes, madam. The sheikh wants you to be comfortable." Over the next few days, Emily was treated like royalty. Every morning, breakfast was brought to her room, fresh fruits, pastries, and exotic dishes she couldn't even name. Personal shoppers visited the palace to help her pick out clothes, while a beautician came daily to do her hair and nails. The sheikh, Khaled, was polite and distant, appearing only briefly to check on her or offer a compliment. At first, Emily thought she had stepped into a dream. The luxury, the attention, and the beautiful surroundings made her feel special, even cherished. She sent messages to her family, telling them about the incredible life she was now living. Her mother replied with relief and gratitude, urging her to be grateful for such a rare opportunity. But as the days turned into weeks, Emily began to notice small cracks in the perfect picture. She realized that every movement she made was being watched. Discreet cameras were installed in the corners of her room, the hallways, even the gardens. Layla's friendly demeanor masked a watchful eye, and every staff member seemed to report directly to the sheikh. The opulence of the palace slowly began to feel less like a blessing and more like a gilded cage. The lavish gifts and luxurious lifestyle couldn't hide the growing unease Emily felt. She had everything she could ever want, yet something inside her whispered that this life was not as perfect as it seemed. For now, she tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, this was the life her family had sacrificed so much for. She told herself that she just needed to adjust, to embrace the new life she had chosen. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that her freedom had been traded for something she didn't fully understand. And as she walked through the glittering halls of the palace, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. At first, Emily tried to adjust to her new life, convincing herself that the luxury and comfort were worth the sacrifices she had made. The palace was beautiful, the staff polite, and her every need seemed to be met. But as time passed, the cracks in this perfect picture started to show. It began with little things, rules that seemed strange but harmless. The sheikh's staff informed her of specific times she was allowed to leave her room and areas of the palace she was forbidden to enter. Her clothes were chosen for her each day, and she was expected to wear only what was approved by the sheikh. Even her meals were monitored, with detailed instructions on what she should eat and when. Emily noticed cameras in almost every room. At first, she thought they were for security, but soon she realized they weren't just watching the palace, they were watching her. Every corner of her suite had small, discreet lenses, tracking her movements. Even the gardens, where she sometimes went to get fresh air, were monitored. The staff seemed nervous around her, always watching what they said or did. When she asked Layla, her maid, why the cameras were everywhere, the woman avoided her eyes and said softly, "It's for your safety, madam." But Emily didn't feel safe. She felt like she was being watched, every move analyzed and judged. The first real sign of the sheikh's controlling nature came when Emily called her family without informing him. It had been weeks since she left Texas, and she missed her parents and siblings terribly. She borrowed Layla's phone to make a quick call, wanting to hear their voices and let them know she was doing okay. The conversation was brief, but it brought her a moment of comfort. Later that evening, the sheikh called her to his study. His tone was calm but cold. "Did you call your family today?" he asked, his eyes fixed on her. Emily hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Yes," she admitted. "I just wanted to check on them." His expression darkened. "You do not make calls without my permission," he said, his voice sharp. "This is my house, my rules. You don't do anything unless I allow it." Emily tried to explain that she meant no harm, but he didn't want to hear it. His voice grew louder, and for the first time, she saw a side of him she hadn't seen before, angry, controlling, and intimidating. He dismissed her with a warning, but the message was clear: her life was no longer her own. The next day, Emily found that her access to phones had been restricted. Layla apologized, explaining that it was the sheikh's order. "I'm sorry, madam. He said no more calls unless he approves them." From that point on, Emily felt the walls closing in. The cameras, the rules, the constant monitoring, it all became suffocating. She realized she couldn't go anywhere or do anything without someone watching her or reporting back to the sheikh. Even the smallest decisions, like what to wear or where to sit, were no longer hers to make. As weeks turned into months, the pressure of living under constant control began to weigh on her. The first instance of violence came when she accidentally broke one of the sheikh's strict rules. She had lingered too long in the garden one evening, enjoying the sunset. When she returned, the sheikh was waiting for her, furious that she had missed dinner. "You disobeyed me," he said, his voice low but filled with anger. Before she could explain, he grabbed her arm tightly, his grip leaving bruises. Emily froze, shocked and terrified. "You will learn to follow my rules," he said, releasing her with a final glare. That night, Emily sat alone in her room, tears streaming down her face. The beautiful palace no longer felt like a dream, it felt like a prison. She realized the life she thought she was stepping into was not one of love or freedom, but control and fear. The sheikh's charm had disappeared, replaced by someone she barely recognized, a man who demanded obedience and punished disobedience without mercy. For the first time, Emily felt the full weight of what she had agreed to. This wasn't the life she had imagined. This was something much darker, and she wasn't sure if she could endure it. As weeks turned into months, Emily's life in the sheikh's palace became a nightmare. The luxury that had once dazzled her now felt like a trap. The constant monitoring, the endless rules, and the growing fear of upsetting the sheikh began to take a toll on her. It was no longer just about controlling what she wore or when she could speak to her family, it became about controlling every aspect of her life. She wasn't a wife, she was a prisoner. The sheikh's paranoia grew worse with each passing day. He started questioning Emily about the smallest things: why she walked to a certain part of the garden, why she spent a few extra minutes in her room, or why she smiled at a staff member. Every action seemed to trigger his suspicion. "What are you hiding from me?" he would ask, his eyes cold and unrelenting. Emily tried to assure him she wasn't hiding anything, but he didn't believe her. One evening, after dinner, the sheikh accused her of looking at one of the guards for too long. Emily, confused and scared, tried to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong. But his rage boiled over. He grabbed her wrist tightly, dragging her back to her room. "You think you can embarrass me?" he shouted. "You belong to me. You'll do as I say." The physical abuse began to escalate. Bruises became a regular part of Emily's life, hidden under the long sleeves and scarves the sheikh insisted she wear. But the psychological abuse was even worse. He would humiliate her, calling her ungrateful and accusing her of plotting against him. The cameras in every corner of the palace felt like eyes constantly watching her, stripping away any sense of privacy. Even her maid, Layla, seemed to grow distant, too afraid to help. Emily felt completely alone, trapped in a world that pretended to be perfect but was anything but. She realized she couldn't leave. The palace gates were guarded, and her passport was locked away in the Sheikh's office. There was no way to contact her family directly, and even if she did, she feared the Sheikh would retaliate against them. Every day felt heavier than the last, and Emily began to wonder if she would ever escape this gilded cage. It was during one of the darkest nights that Emily decided she had to fight back in the only way she could. She didn't have the power to confront the Sheikh directly, but she could make sure that what was happening to her wouldn't be hidden forever. Layla, perhaps out of guilt, secretly helped Emily purchase a small phone from a street vendor. It was an old, simple device, but it was enough. Emily hid it carefully, wrapping it in fabric and tucking it inside the base of a hollow vase in her room. She couldn't afford to let the Sheikh or his staff find it. From that day on, Emily began documenting everything. Late at night, when she was certain no one was watching, she would pull out the phone and record her voice in whispers. "Today is day 45, she said in one of her first recordings. "He accused me of smiling at the gardener. I wasn't, but he didn't believe me. He grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise. I'm scared, but I have to stay strong." She also started taking photos of her injuries, bruises on her wrists, red marks on her face. Every detail was carefully recorded. If the Sheikh yelled at her or punished her, she would write down the exact time and date. She knew she had to create a record of everything that was happening, something that could one day expose the truth. The more she recorded, the more determined she became. Her fear began to shift into anger, a quiet, simmering rage at the man who had taken away her freedom and turned her life into a nightmare. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore, she was planning. She didn't know how or when, but she promised herself she would find a way to get the evidence to someone who could help. As the Sheikh's obsession deepened, so did Emily's resolve. He installed even more cameras, placed motion detectors in her room, and tightened the rules around her movements. But Emily had learned to move carefully, to hide her emotions, and to appear obedient while secretly building her case. One night, as she whispered into the phone, she made a promise to herself. "If anything happens to me," she said, her voice shaking, "I want people to know what he's done. I want the world to see the truth." Emily didn't know if she would ever escape the palace, but she clung to the hope that her recordings could one day bring her justice. She was trapped in a gilded cage, but she refused to let the Sheikh silence her. For the first time in months, she felt a small spark of strength. She wasn't just a victim, she was fighting back, even if it was in secret. And she wasn't going to stop. As the Sheikh's control tightened around her, Emily realized she couldn't afford to wait for help, she had to create her own way out. Every moment she spent in the palace made it clearer that no one would save her unless she found a way to save herself. She began to think carefully, analyzing the routines of the staff, the security systems, and the Sheikh himself. Slowly, a plan started to take shape in her mind. The first step was to understand more of what was happening around her. The Sheikh often spoke in Arabic, especially when giving instructions to his staff or during phone calls. Emily realized that if she could learn the language, even just a little, she might uncover useful information. Using the limited resources available to her, Emily started teaching herself Arabic. She borrowed books from the palace library, pretending she was simply interested in the culture. When Layla, her maid, was alone with her, Emily would ask her to teach her common phrases and words. Layla, who had grown more sympathetic over time, agreed but warned Emily to be careful. "If he finds out, it won't be good," she whispered. Emily was careful to hide her progress. She practiced quietly in her room at night, repeating words and phrases under her breath. She paid attention to the conversations she overheard, slowly piecing together their meaning. Within weeks, she could understand basic commands and phrases, and before long, she began to catch key parts of the Sheikh's discussions. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her small insights into his plans and movements. The second step was building alliances. Emily knew she couldn't escape alone, she would need help from someone on the inside. Layla became her most trusted ally. Although she was cautious and scared, Layla had seen too much of the Sheikh's cruelty to stay silent forever. "He's done this before," Layla admitted one night while helping Emily cover a fresh bruise. "You're not the first bride to go through this." Emily shared her plan with Layla in whispers, explaining how she had been documenting everything on a hidden phone. She told her about the photos, the recordings, and the evidence she had collected. "If I can get this to someone outside, they'll believe me," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. Layla hesitated, fear written all over her face. "It's dangerous," she said. "If he finds out, he'll kill both of us." But after some thought, Layla agreed to help. She began smuggling small items into Emily's room, an extra SIM card, a charger for the phone, and a notebook for Emily to write down key information. With Layla's help, Emily started mapping out the palace. She learned the schedules of the guards, noting when they changed shifts and which areas were less guarded. She memorized the layout of the palace grounds, paying attention to the exits and hidden spots where she could move without being seen. Emily also kept a close eye on the Sheikh's routine. She noted the times he left for meetings, his prayer schedule, and the hours he spent in his private quarters. Over time, she began to see patterns, moments when he was distracted or absent. These small windows of opportunity became the backbone of her escape plan. The final piece of the puzzle was deciding how to get the evidence out. Emily knew she couldn't carry everything with her. If she was caught, it would all be destroyed. Instead, she and Layla came up with a risky but clever solution. Layla would hide copies of the recordings and photos in a safe spot outside the palace. If Emily's escape failed, at least the evidence would survive. Every day brought new risks, but Emily pushed forward. She kept her emotions in check, pretending to obey the Sheikh's rules while working on her plan in secret. The closer she got to completing her preparations, the stronger she felt. For the first time in months, she saw a glimmer of hope. Emily didn't know if her plan would succeed, but she was determined to try. She wasn't going to let the Sheikh control her forever. With her growing knowledge of Arabic, her alliances with Layla, and her carefully collected evidence, Emily believed she had a chance to escape, and to expose the man who had turned her life into a nightmare. Emily had spent months carefully preparing for her escape, documenting every detail of the Sheikh's abusive behavior and the hidden network of trafficking that tied his power together. With the help of Layla, she gathered enough evidence to expose not only the Sheikh's cruelty but also the crimes that supported his luxurious lifestyle. Every photo, every recording, every note was part of a larger plan, a plan to bring down the man who had stolen her freedom. The final step of Emily's plan was to contact someone outside the palace who could help. Through Layla, she learned about an international women's rights organization that worked to rescue women trapped in abusive situations. Layla risked everything by smuggling out a message from Emily, along with a sample of the evidence she had collected. "This has to work," Emily whispered to herself. It was her only chance to make the Sheikh pay for what he had done. The organization responded quickly. They were horrified by the evidence Emily provided and promised to help her escape safely. They began coordinating with local authorities and international agencies to build a case against the Sheikh. Emily felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. She could almost see the end of her nightmare. But the Sheikh's paranoia had also grown. He sensed something was wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The cameras, the guards, and his obsessive control weren't enough to ease his suspicions. He started checking Emily's room more often, going through her belongings and interrogating the staff. Emily knew it was only a matter of time before he found something, but she couldn't stop now. The plan was already in motion. One night, as Emily was preparing to send out another message, the door to her room burst open. The Sheikh stood there, his face twisted with anger. In his hand, he held one of the hidden recordings that Layla had failed to move in time. "What is this?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She tried to deny it, but the sheik wasn't listening. He played one of the recordings, her voice filling the room as she described his abuse and the trafficking network. His rage boiled over. "You think you can betray me? In my own house," he shouted, grabbing her arm and throwing her onto the floor. Emily felt the weight of months of fear and frustration crash down on her. She knew there was no point in lying anymore. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "I'm going to expose you. Everyone will know who you really are." The sheik's anger turned cold. He looked at her with a calm, terrifying expression. "You've made a big mistake," he said quietly. "But don't worry. No one will ever hear your lies." Over the next few hours, the sheik tore through her room, searching for more evidence. He found the phone with her recordings, the photos, and the notes she had written. Emily's carefully built case was being destroyed right in front of her eyes. But what the sheik didn't know was that the organization she had contacted already had enough to act. The message and evidence Layla had smuggled out were safe, and they were working behind the scenes to ensure Emily's story wouldn't be silenced. As the sheik ordered his guards to lock Emily in a separate wing of the palace, she felt a flicker of hope. Her body ached from the violence, and her spirit felt crushed, but she knew she had succeeded in one crucial way: her story was no longer hidden. The recordings were out there, the evidence was in the right hands, and the truth about the sheik's crimes was on the verge of being exposed. The next day, the sheik tried to act as though nothing had happened, but his world was already starting to crumble. Authorities began questioning his business associates, and whispers of an investigation spread through Dubai's elite circles. Emily, though confined and under constant watch, held on to the knowledge that her actions had set something bigger in motion. The sheik underestimated the power of the truth. Even as he tried to destroy Emily and her evidence, he couldn't erase what had already been shared. The organization worked tirelessly to ensure that Emily's recordings reached the right people, and soon, the authorities had enough to raid the palace. As the sheik's guards burst into Emily's room to drag her away, she looked up at them with a quiet determination. She had done what she came to do. She had fought back in the only way she could, and she knew that the truth would come out. The sheik may have silenced her for the moment, but he couldn't stop what was already in motion. Emily had given everything to expose the man who had trapped her. And even though she didn't know what would happen next, she held on to one thought: the sheik's reign of terror was coming to an end, and justice was finally on its way. The palace was eerily quiet the night the confrontation happened. Emily sat in her room, feeling the weight of her choices. She knew the sheik was furious after finding her hidden recordings. His calm facade had broken, replaced by a dangerous rage. She had crossed a line he could never forgive, and she sensed the danger growing with every passing minute. Suddenly, the door to her room burst open. The sheik stormed in, his face twisted with fury. In his hand, he held the phone that contained Emily's recordings. "You think you can betray me?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can ruin me?" Emily didn't reply. She was terrified, but she refused to show it. She stood her ground, staring at him, even though her heart was racing. "The world will know what you've done," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "You can't hide forever." Her defiance only enraged him further. In a fit of anger, he grabbed her and threw her against the wall. The force knocked the wind out of her, but she refused to cry out. "You've destroyed everything," he shouted, pacing the room like a caged animal. "But you won't live to see the consequences." Emily tried to stay strong, but the violence escalated quickly. The sheik's rage turned deadly as he struck her again and again, taking out his fury on the young woman who had dared to challenge him. The last thing Emily thought of was her family, her mother, her father, and her siblings. She hoped they would one day know the truth and understand that she had done this for them. When it was over, the room fell silent. Emily's lifeless body lay on the floor, and the sheik stood over her, breathing heavily. For a moment, he seemed almost dazed, as if realizing the gravity of what he had done. But his cold, calculating side quickly took over. He called his most trusted guards and ordered them to cover up what had happened. "Take care of this," he said sharply. "No one must ever know." However, what the sheik didn't realize was that Emily's evidence hadn't been fully destroyed. Before he found her phone, Layla, the maid, had already smuggled copies of the recordings and photos out of the palace. Hidden in a safe location, the evidence was waiting to be delivered to the women's rights organization Emily had contacted. Layla, heartbroken over Emily's death, risked her life to ensure that the truth wouldn't die with her. She handed over the evidence to the organization, along with her own testimony about the sheik's actions. The recordings were undeniable proof of his crimes, detailing not only Emily's suffering but also the trafficking network he was part of. Emily's life was tragically cut short, but her courage and determination ensured that her story didn't end there. The evidence she risked everything to gather would soon spark an investigation that would bring the sheik to justice and expose the darkness behind his wealth and power. Emily's voice, captured in her recordings, would not be silenced. The moment Layla handed over Emily's recordings to the women's rights organization, everything changed. The organization wasted no time. They reviewed the evidence. Photos of Emily's injuries, voice recordings describing the abuse, and details of the trafficking network the sheik was involved in. The proof was undeniable. It wasn't just about Emily's suffering, it exposed a much larger system of corruption and exploitation. The organization decided to act quickly. They sent the evidence to trusted journalists and authorities in both the UAE and the United States. Within days, Emily's recordings began to surface online. Her voice, shaky but strong, described the horrors she had endured and the crimes she had witnessed. "My name is Emily Carter," one recording began. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it, but I need the world to know the truth." The recordings went viral almost instantly. Social media platforms were flooded with posts about Emily's story. Hashtags like #JusticeForEmily and #EndTrafficking began trending worldwide. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it across the globe. People were outraged, not only by what had happened to Emily but also by the network of trafficking and abuse that had been hidden for years. In Dubai, the public reaction was explosive. For years, rumors had circulated about powerful men abusing their positions, but Emily's recordings made it impossible to ignore. In the United States, protests erupted, demanding justice for Emily and an end to trafficking. Politicians, activists, and celebrities joined the calls for action, amplifying her story even further. The pressure on the UAE government became too great to ignore. Authorities launched an investigation into the sheik and the trafficking network he was part of. Within days, his palace was raided. Police uncovered more evidence, including financial records and hidden documents that detailed years of illegal activity. Emily's recordings had opened the floodgates, and the sheik's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. He was arrested on charges of human trafficking, abuse, and murder. His wealth and influence, which had once protected him, were no longer enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. Other members of the trafficking ring were also arrested, and the network was dismantled piece by piece. As the news spread, Emily's story became a symbol of hope and courage. People praised her bravery in gathering the evidence that exposed the sheik's crimes. Women who had been silenced for years began to come forward, inspired by Emily's determination. Her voice had sparked a global conversation about abuse, trafficking, and the importance of fighting for justice. Though Emily's life had been tragically cut short, her recordings ensured that her story would not be forgotten. She had exposed the truth, and because of her, countless others were saved from the same fate. In her death, Emily became a powerful voice for justice, proving that even in the darkest of circumstances, one person's courage could change the world. Emily's tragic story sent shockwaves across the globe. Her courage in documenting her suffering and exposing the crimes of the Sheikh and his trafficking network became a turning point. The outrage sparked by her recordings forced governments and organizations to act, ensuring that her death would not be in vain. In both the UAE and the United States, lawmakers responded swiftly. The UAE introduced stricter marriage laws, requiring detailed background checks for cross-national marriages, especially those involving young women. New regulations were put in place to prevent exploitation, including mandatory welfare checks for foreign brides and limits on age gaps in arranged marriages. Officials who had turned a blind eye to trafficking networks were investigated and removed from their positions. In the United States, Emily's case led to the creation of new programs aimed at protecting vulnerable young women. Partnerships between international governments were formed to track and dismantle trafficking operations. Laws were passed to hold brokers and traffickers accountable, with harsher penalties for those involved in such crimes. Women's rights organizations took Emily's story as a rallying cry. They launched initiatives to educate families in impoverished communities about the dangers of trafficking disguised as marriage proposals. Campaigns raised awareness about the tactics used by brokers, empowering women and their families to recognize and resist exploitation. Safe shelters were established for women escaping abusive situations, providing them with support and resources to rebuild their lives. The Emily Carter Foundation was established by the women's rights organization that had helped expose the Sheikh's crimes. The foundation focused on rescuing and supporting victims of trafficking, offering them legal assistance, education, and a path to a better future. Emily's name became a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced and trapped. In schools, colleges, and community centers, Emily's story was shared as an example of bravery and resistance. Her recordings were played at events and conferences, reminding the world of the power of one voice to bring about change. "If you're hearing this," Emily had said in her recordings, "it means I didn't make it, but I need the world to know the truth." Those words inspired countless others to stand up against injustice. In Dubai, the palace where Emily had suffered was converted into a shelter for women escaping abusive marriages and trafficking. Its glittering walls, once a symbol of power and oppression, now stood as a beacon of hope and safety. Emily's family, though devastated by her loss, found some comfort in the impact of her story. "She was brave," her mother said during an interview. "She gave her life so others could be saved." Emily's siblings grew up knowing their sister had changed the world, and they carried her legacy forward by supporting efforts to prevent trafficking in their community. Emily's voice lived on, a reminder of the strength it takes to fight against injustice. Her story brought light to a dark world and ensured that countless others would be spared from the same fate. In the end, Emily became more than a victim, she became a symbol of courage, resistance, and the enduring power of truth.